Good morning and welcome to the Bible study for this morning. We are in the book of 1 Kings. We're in the book of 1 Kings. Typically what I do when I do a class, I put my notes online before class. If you ever want to go there, that's typically where you'll find them. If you want to write that down, that's the address. I do have to admit that at this moment my head is swimming with so much information. I'm just trying to tread water on this one. There's so many things that happen in this book, and especially at this specific time at the beginning of the book, and as well as there are many things that God doesn't tell us in Kings. There are things in Chronicles that make things even more difficult to understand, and maybe there's no way to come to a complete understanding about things, which is typical for a lot of historical writings, and it's no different for the Bible as well. Maybe God didn't want us to know specific things. That's why he didn't have it written down. And of course, there's a lot of supposition out there between the Jewish leadership. There's midrash writings. There's all kinds of commentary that come after all these things happen, and we'll talk a little bit about all that. But first, we kind of want to get into the breakdown of the book itself, the review, and we're going to kind of get a 30,000-foot view of the overall flow of the book. What is the book about? Why is this the book of Kings? And in Barry Kirchhoff's book, if you don't have a book, I think there's some over there. In his book, he references a parallel study with the Chronicles. So if you want to read the Chronicles, that's okay. I've been doing that as well. It makes me think of Nebuchadnezzar, who he couldn't sleep. So he had them come in and read his Chronicles so he could fall asleep. And so that's basically what it is. Chronicles is just that. We're going to tell about certain order of things. And so that's kind of the reading of Chronicles. Not that it's boring necessarily, but there's things in there that you don't find in Kings, like genealogies, these gigantic genealogies, and there's a lot of structure of the temple. You know, here are the people, and we're going to get into that a little bit today because there's a lot of controversy on how we should think about some things. Not big controversy, just questionable things. And so we kind of do want to do that. We want to look at Chronicles along with this because it's important to see this overall view of everything. So before we begin our study, let's have a word of prayer. Our great and holy Father, we're so thankful, Lord, that we could be here this morning. We're so thankful for your Son, that he unites us and brings us here together. We're especially thankful for your word, and that for us it is priceless and beautiful and powerful. We hope and pray, Lord, that all things we do and say this morning would be in accordance with your will. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, the Kings. Where does the Kings sit in the history of Israel, right? Israel essentially starts at the time of Abraham, and then many years later we see Moses come along, and here are the Kings. And the Kings sets in the second dispensation that God sent out during the time when they had a law. The law of the covenant was that law with them. And it's towards the end of that era, before Jesus comes along. It lasts, I don't know, some 500 years or whatever it is. And then there's another 400 years or so of silence from God. The dispensation comes later with Jesus. That's the third dispensation. That's where we live. So we all know this. That's one of the first things we learn when we're being converted, hopefully, when we learn the overview of the Bible. So that's where we are. In our books, there is this chart here, the contrast of the kings, and well, I'm going to go ahead and read Barry's introduction. The book of the Kings and Chronicles are some of the most challenging in the Bible. They cover a period of about 400 years from the pinnacle of Israel's greatness in the days of Solomon to the destruction of the temple and the fall of Israel as a nation. So it's kind of a depressing book in a sense, you know. But more importantly is we need to always ask ourselves, what does God want me to learn from this, and how does it point to Jesus? I think that should be always at the forefront of our minds. After the reign of Solomon, the accounts of 38 kings are told, 19 each from the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Therefore, before entering into a detailed study of these books, it's important to see the big picture of their theme and how the books relate to one another. Though in our English Bibles, the Kings and Chronicles are divided into 4 books, in the Hebrew Bible, there's only 1 book for each. The 2 books were only divided into 4 books by the translators of the Septuagint version about 300 BC. Look carefully at the first chart of your booklet and contrast Kings and Chronicles. Now I'm going to say this. I don't have an answer for this first question, so I want you guys to tell me if you see it. Notice how the first books of the Kings and Chronicles overlap each other in the history they cover. What do you notice that the Kings has that the Chronicles does not cover? And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, well, I don't know. If we're talking about what the Chronicles has, I can see what the Chronicles have that the Kings doesn't cover, right? The Chronicles has the reign of David, and it has all these genealogies that you don't necessarily find so much in the book in the book of Kings. I think as far as structure in Kings, I found that there's more details in stories, and there's a lot more stories. Yes. Okay.
Chronicles doesn't cover the kings of Israel.
Chronicles doesn't king. Oh, okay.
I don't think. That was what I found.
Okay. Sue says yes, so you're right.
We didn't hear it. What did she say?
Chronicles doesn't cover the kings of Israel. Okay. Why do you think that is? Because they were so bad. Yes.
Well, I think it covers David and David's lineage.
Okay.
It breaks off at some point where the kings in northern Israel no longer are David's lineage. So no longer have a place for them to participate.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. It says right there in 2 Chronicles at the bottom part, the history of Judah to the captivity. So it's more about, it's Judah-centered, which makes sense. How does that apply to us? How would that apply to the Jews in the time of Jesus? That's my point. Why would God include mostly the Judean, the Judah part of it? Because Jesus came from them. So yeah, you can see that also, the differences in the Kings and Chronicles. And there's differences of approach and what they wanted to be detailed. You have prophecy and perspective, and the Chronicles seems to be pointed more towards spiritual. That's kind of what I think I wrote in there. Yeah, one was a focus on man and the Kings, and then the Chronicles is a focus on God. Okay, anybody want to add to that? Ida.
I was just going to say another contrast is Kings depressing, as you said.
Yes.
The Chronicles shows God's
Okay. There's hope, right? There's more hope in the Chronicles. Okay. There's more hope in Chronicles than what you find in the Kings. Kings is a little more depressing. And, you know, once you get to 10, chapter 10, and Kings is like, oh, you know, in my mind anyway. Where would you put the book of 2 Samuel on the chart? I put it over there where you have the reign of David. That's where I put it. I don't know if anybody had anything different. What do the books of Chronicles seem to be mainly concerned about, and what is the writer of the Kings mainly concerned about? We already talked about that. Some are more detailed about stories and lives, and some are more detailed about righteousness toward God. Yes?
Chronicles is geared more for the exiles who returned as well.
Okay.
Ezra wrote that.
Okay.
So it seemed to be more of a geared towards those who were in captivity, basically, how those who were in captivity.
Okay. So again, that Chronicles is addressing the hope that they should have. And again, they would be looking for that hope when Jesus comes along. And of course, they thought it was going to look different. They were still thinking about Solomon and David and all that. So they didn't understand it. Even the disciples didn't understand it. Okay, anybody else? Okay. What is the purpose in having two different accounts of the period of the kings? I just said, multiple perspectives are going to address. This is just more to the same thing in my mind. They just highlight an emphasis on different subjects. It also, in my mind, adds to the authoritative part of this. You have multiple people writing these books, and a lot of people want to say multiple people writing a book is going to be an issue. Well, it isn't an issue with God, because he's God. He's the one writing the book. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? What's the purpose of having these two accounts? Anybody? Okay. We do that today. We have lots of people writing historical books about the same thing. Okay, on this graph, look carefully at the next chart. You can see how the books of 1st and 2nd Kings should be thought of as one book. And in what ways is the end of the book in contrast to the beginning of the book? The beginning of the book, you've got peace and tranquility. The name Solomon means peace. And I think Nathan named him Jedediah, which is more somebody from God, that kind of thing. So we see this tranquility in the beginning, and at the end we see Assyrian captivity, temple destroyed. So there's the contrast, right? You have this great nation that David is, I want to say this, David is leaving this for Solomon, all right? The great nation is Solomon's to lose. This is all David's doing by the hand of God. And that's how it begins. And of course, we'll get into all that other, whatever happens later. So, what chapter of the book is the crucial turning point of the story? Anybody looking at this chart? Chapter 11. Yeah. This is when that terrible verse says, and Solomon turns from God. And it's, they blame his wife. Always find that interesting. Because he listened to the voice of his wife. So, yeah, and we're going to talk a lot about that today as well, when we get into this first part of the chapter and all of that. I think it's chapter 11, and everything just goes down. And nothing is the same after that. Everything's going great. And then, when I was filling this thing out, I do have all my quick notes on that website that I posted earlier. And when you start getting into 15, 16, 17, these guys are like killing each other hand over, just, there's in Israel, there's no peace at all. And we'll get into all the whys when we get to that. But Not a good time. How many kings did the nation of Israel have, ultimately? 0, right? We know that. They have no good kings. None of them are good. And, by the time you get to Ahab, everything is in the gutter, spiritually. In what chapter and in what year did the nation of Israel fall? Chapter 18, verse 20, year 721. Anybody who learned from Barry Kurtzville, he just hammered those 2 dates, 721, 586. In what chapter and what year did the nation of Judah fall? Chapter 25, in the year 586 BC. Okay, any questions about this overview of the book? I don't want to make it sound depressing. Because ultimately, again, the idea behind this is that there is hope, and that comes in the form of Jesus. Any questions or anything, concerns? Okay. Oh, real quick. The first part of the book covers the story of Solomon. The last part of the book, of course, is the fall of Israel. The main prophet in the book is Elijah. And by the time Elijah comes, again, everything is just helter-skelter in Israel. And we'll get into the why, again, when we get to that 11 chapters from now. We'll talk about why that becomes so. Okay, so for chapter 1, there are a few things we kind of have to cover, and I apologize. I don't mean to drag on the intro so much, but there are several things we have to consider before we grow into an understanding of what the people of the day would understand, how they would understand it. We live in the 21st century. We have women's rights. We have a government that is not a theocracy. We have all kinds of different things today. We have comforts of our homes. I don't know if any of us are farmers. We are nothing like they were back then, in that sense, culturally. We have the written Word of God in multiple places throughout our house. We can have Bibles open everywhere. We're greatly blessed because of that. That's not the case here. This is something that God would tell them. You go hear the Word. You go hear the Word once a year, and wear it on your forehead. That's how much you need to be paying attention to these things, because they didn't have it written down. And so if they had little snippets of sayings, they would have it, but they didn't have entire Bibles at their disposal. This is completely different people, a complete different culture. There was lots of paganism going on, lots of evil going on in the world, just like there is today. They don't call it paganism, but it's very much the same. So, also, one of the several of the things we need to consider was David's age and his perceived impotence an issue, number one. In Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 23, and we're going to look at that very quickly here, and 29, addresses the coronation of Solomon. We're going to look at that because it's important to understand that what's going on in Kings is kind of, they're kind of supplementing each other, if you will. And was it God's intent for the king to have multiple wives? Who said that? You're right. He didn't. And we know that first. I mean, if you took the Jesus view from it, you go all the way back to Genesis. He did not want anybody having multiple wives if you go that route. But in Deuteronomy 17, he talks about them not taking on many wives. So that kind of leaves it open that maybe you can have more than one. And we know that God allowed that for a time. But he doesn't want them having many wives. Does David have many wives? Yeah, he does have many wives. There's at least 6 that we know of. They're in the oral tradition, in the Jewish communities, he had like 18 wives. And I don't know. We can't know exactly, but he did have, he had way more than what he needed. And we're going to talk about those kinds of relationships and all of that as well. So it's also important to remember, I'm sorry?
I just said Jews, too many.
Too many. Yes. So Adonijah was born in Hebron, okay, just as a reminder. So that was at the very beginning of David's rule. And Solomon is very young. And we need to kind of visualize what's going on here. Some people say he was young as 12. Other people put him at 14 because then he would be past the age of 13. Other people say he was 18 or 20. It's kind of hard to know. The only indication of anything that I saw in the timeline was when he started his rule, Rehoboam was already 1. So not likely he was 12. It's more likely he was a young man. Yes, Kay?
I was going to say, if he hadn't had multiple wives, he wouldn't have had Solomon.
Okay, we're going to get into that. We're going to talk about all this because this is all very, very interesting how God's providence works in this, isn't it? Because it isn't about the law. If there's one thing we learn from David, in my opinion, this is my opinion, I'll throw it out there for whatever. If there's one thing we learn about David, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the differences between him and Saul. And there's one gigantic difference. One gigantic difference is Saul would not own up to his sin. He kept making excuses for it. He wanted to embrace his sin. He wanted to continue to sin. David, on the other hand, confessed his sin. He understood the power of confession, which Jesus, the Christ, reveals to us later. The power of confession and owning your sin and being humble towards God in that vein. Yes, Ida. And that is a gigantic difference that we see between these 2 kings. And Jesus is the one that reveals it to them later because they had done what? They had started to rely on the law. They relied on the law, which is a good thing. You have to obey the law. But they thought you got salvation through the law. You do not get salvation through the law. You are convicted by the law. You are reminded that you sin. And Jesus took care of all of that. And that was their big issue. And we also need to understand, by law, David should have been executed. And he sought God's mercy and his grace and received it. And he still suffered the consequences of it, but he was forgiven of it, or at least atoned for it. And I can't say anything about that. That was the evidence. Those are the evidences given to us. He didn't die. He wasn't taken out of the city and stoned, which was the law. So this is that's a big overview, including the fact that here you have this horrible relationship that David has, including conspiracy to murder and adultery, and yet the Christ comes through that relationship. And I think if there's anything to garner from that, it's God can take the worst of situations and turn it around on its head. We weren't there to see any of this, but I can only imagine Satan accusing God of, look at what David's doing. And God going, okay, well, the Christ is coming. God turns Satan on his head continually. What looks like should be something terrible. He's the only one who can do anything like that. Okay, so all of these questions are out there really quick, and if you would, please,
Mark, I didn't say.
I don't- did you want to finish?
I was just gonna say that arguing from a conclusion or a historical event is always a little suspect.
Mhm.
We should, just because there was an evil man in Germany, that started killing a lot of people and taking countries over, doesn't mean my parents might never have met. That might have happened another way, I don't know. Probably they would have met. But, just because David sinned doesn't mean that God wouldn't have blessed, Israel with a king as great as Solomon. But maybe because of David's sin, that's why Solomon, continued to follow the course that he did. I'm not saying he didn't take his fault, it's Solomon's fault, but God's gonna have a bigger imagination than I have.
Yes.
He can come up with all kinds of ways to bless us.
Yes.
Without having sinned.
And I think he would prefer that it wasn't that way. I mean, if we know the character of God, he would rather that we don't sin. That's why Jesus hung on the cross, right? So that we would move away from that paradigm. Okay, really quick, I just want to go over this because it's important to the story. In my mind, 1 Chronicles chapter 23. 1 Chronicles chapter 23, verse 1. Now when David reached old age, he made his son Solomon king over Israel, and he gathered together all the leaders of Israel with the priests and the Levites. And then it goes through, this is the Chronicles, so it talks about the offices of the Levites and the Gershonites, the Kohathites, the Merarites. Talks about their duties, the divisions of the Levites. And then it goes into chapter 25. Moreover, David, it talks about the commanders of the army and the musicians and all those things that were going to have to take place with musical instruments and the choirs and all that would be in the temple. This is temple-centered. David's talking about the temple. It talks about the gatekeepers, the keepers of the treasury, and then the commanders of the army. And I'm just reading the chapter headings. And again in chapter 28, David's addressing this again. Now, he already talked about Solomon being king, and he says Solomon's going to be king. He already covered that. So, again, David does this again, and he addresses the temples, these temple things, and he starts talking about 28:1. David assembled Jerusalem, the officials of Israel, the princes of the tribes, the commanders, the divisions that served the king, the commanders of thousands. He rose to his feet. In verse 2, listen to me, my brethren and my people. I had intended to build a permanent home for the ark of the covenant of the Lord and for the footstool of our God. So I had made preparations to build it, but God said to me, you shall not build the house for my name, because you are a man of war and have shed blood. Yet the Lord God of Israel chose me from all the house of my father to be king over Israel forever. For he has chosen Judah to be a leader in the house of Judah, my father's house, and among the sons of my father, he took pleasure in me to make me king over Israel. And then later on, he says in verse 20, then David said to his son Solomon, be strong and courageous and act. Do not fear nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God, my God, is with you. He will not fail you nor forsake you until all the work for the service of the house of the Lord is finished. Now behold, there are the divisions of the priests, and he talks about all this again. And then he has in verse 29 a prayer. And then in verse 21 of chapter 29, he says, on the next day they made sacrifices to the Lord and offered burnt offerings to the Lord, 1,000 bulls, 1,000 rams, 1,000 lambs. That's a lot of animals. with their drink offerings and sacrifices in abundance for all Israel. So they ate and drank that day before the Lord with great gladness. And they made Solomon, the son of David, king a second time. And they anointed him as ruler for the Lord, and Zadok as priest. And that's important to see that. This is when Zadok is made priest. And this whole priest thing and all these people, all of this is so very close. These people are friends, they're relatives, and they've known each other a very long time. And this is all very interesting to see how all of these things unfold, because power is so corrupts so many people. So it's important to see this. Solomon is made king, and then some time passes, and he has to be made king again. And so we need to kind of fit what's going to happen in Kings into that timeline. At least that's how I saw it when I looked at it. Any questions? I'm sorry if I've droned on too long. Any questions? Comments? Observations? Lisa?
Like you read, First Chronicles 28, you read 20, something I had noticed when I thought was right. Is he won't leave you or forsake you until all the work for the Lord's house and service is finished.
Interesting.
Until.
Until.
So I thought that was,
I'll have to look at that word.
yeah.
See?
Kind of an interesting follow there. Never had read that before or noticed it.
Okay. All right. So we're going to read verses 1 through 10, and we'll give a brief summary. Now, King David was old, advanced in age, and they covered him in clothes, but he could not keep warm. So his servants said to him, "Let them seek a young virgin for my lord the king, and let her attend the king and become his nurse, and let her lie in your bosom, so that my lord the king may keep warm." So they searched for a beautiful girl throughout the territory of Israel, and found Abishag the Shunammite, and brought her to the king. The girl was very beautiful, and she became the king's nurse, and she served him, but the king did not cohabitate with her. Cohabit. Now Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, "I will be king." So he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen. This sounds familiar. With 50 men to run before him. His father had never crossed him at any time, asking, "Why have you done so?" And he was also a very handsome man. And he was born after Absalom. He had confirmed with Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and with Abiathar, the priest, and following Adonijah, they helped him. And we need to understand, or at least ask why that happened. But Zadok, the priest, Benaniah, the son of Jehoiada, Nathan, the prophet, Shimei, Rei, and the mighty men who helped David were not with Adonijah. Adonijah sacrificed sheep and oxen and fatlings by the stone of Zoheleth, which is beside En Rogel. And he invited all his brothers, the king's sons, and all the men of Judah, the king's servants. But he did not invite Nathan the prophet, Benaniah, the mighty men, and Solomon, his brother. Okay, so here's Adonijah. We're going to start the Kings with some intrigue, right? First thing that's going to happen is this guy, Adonijah, is going to be king. He's going to try and make himself king. He was older, as I pointed out. He was much older than Solomon. So why is this an issue? It says here, we're going to talk about Bathsheba and David and all that, but is this an issue? If you're just reading this, does it look like it's an issue? Why is it an issue? It just looks like this guy wants to be king. He's going to make himself king. David doesn't say anything, and we'll get into that. It doesn't, if you were just reading this and you didn't have any history or anything, you would think, oh, this guy wants to be king. But what does it remind, who does it remind us? Yes, Lisa.
Well, a lot like, Absalom.
Yes, Absalom.
There's always seems to be a power struggle.
Yes.
But he knew better. And the reason we know he knew better is he didn't fight those men.
There you go. Okay. Some deductive reasoning there. Yeah, he doesn't invite Solomon. That tells us something. He doesn't invite Solomon and Benaniah. Do you remember who Benaniah is? Anybody? Benaniah he's a general, right? And I can't remember who those guys are called. But there's basically, when you look at David's armies, they're multifaceted. He would have the regular militia of Israel, and then he had these other guys, not the Pelethites, but anyway, Cherethites and Pelethites. Say that again?
He was the commander of the Chelethites.
Chelethites. Thank you, Chelethites. Chelethite means executioner.
Cherethites.
Cherethites.
C-H-E-R-A-T-H-I-T-S.
I'll get it. Essentially, this is David's secret service. Okay, they're pretty much mercenaries, and now Benaniah is Jewish, but these guys are supposedly from Ziklag, and they may even been Philistines, but they're pretty much, they're there to kill people. They're there to protect the king, and they're paid, and Benaniah is over them. David puts them over them when Absalom is coming after him. Yes?
I was just going to, it's a small point, but because we live in, Republic,
Yeah.
to me, it looks like the United States is going out and promoting himself,
Yeah,
nominating himself.
he
as
is.
king. But if we live in a monarchy, like even England maybe 200 years ago,
Yes,
that would have been, thought he would have been a traitor in the
exactly. Excellent point. And that shows the differences in culture after, a couple of few thousand years. We live in this democracy, and it wouldn't be a big deal for somebody to say, I want to be president, right? I want to be president. That's not a big deal. But under a monarchy, whoops, you're threatening the guy who's there. And that brings up my other point. Why would Adonijah feel empowered to do this? Obviously, there's a big deal, and we're going to talk about David's lack of, yes?
Well, for the same reason that Joab agrees to help him. Like, Joab's always done what he thinks is right.
Yeah.
And when that lines up with, what's best for David, we commend him for that. But his intention is always, this is what I think should happen. It's not, what does God think? That's not in Joab's vocabulary. And so Joab thinks this is the best thing for the kingdom. And Adonijah thinks the same thing. I'm going to be a better ruler than my little brother.
Little brother is a great point. We're talking maybe 18, something like that. Maybe 20. Some people say maybe he was as old as 20, because when he dies, he's supposedly old. Yes. David and then Lisa.
Well, one thing, in addition to Marion, was the point of that pronounce names, Adoniah or whatever, Adoniah. He took after his brother Absalom. He did this. Both of them failed to realize the most important thing was they didn't get to decide who was king. God got to decide who was king.
Lisa?
Second Chronicles, it said that Solomon's inexperienced.
Yes. Yes, David even says that.
So I could see that Joab felt like it wasn't his time, it wasn't his
Right.
chance yet. He may have agreed that at some point in time Solomon should be king, and at this point, he's young and inexperienced and probably not good.
Okay.
Because they aren't looking at the spiritual community.
Yeah, in Chronicles itself, David says, you need to help Solomon. He's young. He's basically a boy in your eyes, which I don't know how true that was, but he's young. He needs your help. So my other point about this, and we're going to get to how David's lack of parental control has this effect, but it was also viewed that when a king became old and he wasn't fathering children or anything like that, he became ill. Or in some pagan views even, I don't even know if it was just a pagan view, that if the king had some sort of deformity or if he was disabled or something like that, that was viewed not just the people who lived there, but that was viewed of the surrounding nations, that king is weak. That makes the country vulnerable. And so we see the opening part of this is what? What is it talking about? The very opening part of this chapter.
David's about to die.
David's old. He can't even keep warm, which is scary because I can't keep myself. My hands are freezing this morning.
Mine too, Mark.
Okay. Oh, I feel much better. I feel better. So yeah, this kind of casts this light on what's going on, not just the reality of David being old, but what happens to the minds of the people who are reading this, and more importantly, what's going on in the minds of the people who are seeing this. These people are concerned, the people who are serving David, they are concerned that their king can't even keep himself warm. So they go get this beautiful girl, the Shunammite. There's some speculation that maybe the Shunammite was actually the Shulamite from the Song of Solomon. I don't think that's the case. What's that? Anyway, I don't think that's the case, but it might be. They tried to make this about the woman, and it's not, I don't think. Okay, so I think this is really what's going on in other people's that are serving David. That's going on in their minds. But we also need to put this in the context of Chronicles, where you have Solomon being made king by David already, and then it's likely that happened, and then this happened. That Adonijah comes along to usurp what David had already put forward. And it's important to remember, or to know anyway, that David makes the claim that it's God who chose Solomon. He says that he chooses Solomon, but he also says that God is the one who chose him. And so now we're going to see the second thing happen between those two coronations of Solomon. Okay, any questions? Any observations? We haven't got much time. So yeah, that kind of opens the scene where you have Abishag given to David. I think the term as an electric blanket is pretty good. I like that. I heard that from somebody. I heard that from Ida. I think that's a good term because he can't keep warm. She's given to him, and now she's ministering to him. What's the second point about this that we hear? That why is that in there? Anybody?
Well, she does become important in the story.
She does. Okay. The second point is that, in my mind anyway, the king doesn't have relations with her. Right? That was my thinking.
There might be the appearance
I'm sorry?
The man appeared that he had, that he still had his virility that he had to show.
Right,
That might have been interference.
right.
Counts for that weakness.
Yeah, I think this is actually a test of his virility. It really is. Because with a weak king, you're vulnerable. So we're going to get into all of that next week, and we'll get into David's lack of parenting and all the things that affected all this thing. And we'll go from there. Thank you.